This would be interesting. We have Ken and Kent. It'll have to be like, it'll be like effect and affect, right? It'll be Ken and Kent.
Story of my life.
Social distortion. I suppose with that we can get rolling after our customary entry period. So welcome everybody to the review session for Anti-Oedipus, Chapter 3, Section 4, Psychoanalysis and Ethnology. So I guess we can jump right into it then. Does anybody have any questions? Awesome. So how about this then? Yesterday I was concerned about the word cure. And I've always kind of been skeptical of that word. And I think some discussion cropped up about that. How do you guys understand the word cure here?
Which page are you referring to?
The original point was made on 166, 167, but it continues into like 168, where he's talking about, where they're talking about schizoanalysis and like the way the medicine man sort of like is doing schizoanalysis without really like trying to do it like the Lewis and Guattari are.
I'll tell you what I think of cure. I think that there's a subtle joke in here in which they're kind of I don't quite know how to express this, but they're kind of comparing Lacan's cure to that of Shaman.
Yeah, and in a broader sense, right? Like the framework of psychoanalysis and like how we're using it for interpretation in contrast to the way the shaman engages society here. Varun, the first mention of it is
why don't you just read it out? Read it out loud.
Yeah, I got you. On the contrary, it is evident that the individual and the family, however young, directly invests a social, historical, economic, and political field that is not reducible to any mental structure or affective constellation. That is why when one considers pathological cases and processes of cure in primitive societies, it seems to us entirely insufficient to compare them with psychoanalytic procedure by relating the criteria borrowed from the latter. They go on. It is from this point of view that we must consider many primitive cures, plural. They are schizoanalysis in action.
I think the thing is, it might be two interpretations here, but I don't think they want to superimpose one on the top of the other. That might be one of that. Because, one of the things in this book is that it's a superimposition in the sense that desiring production is political economy, right? They say the schizo practices political economy and like flows of desire. Because, that's a mistake that Wilhelm Reich made, right? According to them, that Wilhelm Reich wasn't able to produce a full theory, right? Even though he did place a primacy to social repression, unlike most of the almost dogmatic psychoanalysis of his day, what he didn't have was desired production, which allowed him to essentially combine the two sort of realms of social production and sexual production all together, which is one of the things they're trying to do. I think part of it is that they don't want to sort of impose, where they say, okay, so that's just an example of psychoanalysis. I think I'm a bit lost, actually. Maybe I just don't know too much about Levi Strauss, but how are they understanding it as a primitive form of schizoanalysis or something like that? I mean, I think if we want to consider, then we have to look at the social field in this regard. So, I mean, the thing about the social field during savage societies, I think it's noted pretty clearly that savage society. I mean, the decoded flow. So this decoded flows in terms of capitalism are in excess, right? There's decoded flows everywhere. Well, the whole point of coding in savage societies to avoid decoded flows. That's why there's all these ritualistic practices in savage societies, or debt relations, which is, debt relations can be linked pretty clearly to anti-production in this case, where the debt relation is sort of a coding to prevent that decoded flow. And I think part of it, if we have to understand what they mean by the schizoanalysis and medicine man, we need to look at that.
Yeah, I agree, and we can definitely move into that passage. But one thing I want to think about as we move into that is and Ken, maybe you can help us out here, since I have a feeling you might know more about this than I do, at least. But so we might ask the question, what does psychoanalysis seek to cure? And therefore, what is in need of a cure? And then in contrast, what is schizoanalysis take as needing a cure? And what then is a cure there?
I mean, it depends on who you're getting it from. So for Lacan, he, of course, tries to be an edgelord and says that the cure of psychoanalysis is the cure of believing one can be cured. And so you have things like transitioning the fundamental fantasy, which would be, for some, it's the Eros principle. So turning two into one of love. So, which is like transference or something. And sometimes I wonder if it's the cure from demanding things. But yeah, and also sometimes it seems like the cure is the cure of idealizing things. So like you don't experience like, I don't know, jouissance to a certain extent. And so you also don't get your hopes let down or something like that. But as regards to what, sometimes it's like the cure to attachment, but I don't know how this relates to, the cure of Toulouse and Guattari of schizoanalysis.
Yeah, and we'll look at the passage in a minute. And of course, anyone, if you'd like to jump in, please do. No muting here. I suppose what I'm kind of wondering is like, the cure for psychoanalysis, as I understand it, seems to be something like subjecting yourself to like the one-on-one therapy, right? Where you go into like a room with a psychoanalyst and their interpretation, and that leads you to something like a cure. And in that way, right, like a problematic is supposed to be discovered, and in this case, Oedipus. It's
supposed to be it's supposed to be the talking cure, in the sense that why it's called the talking cure is that you need to discover. So you have, in Freud you have primal repression, right? And that's what repression is latent because it has the time to come back, and it is potential to come back. So it's about essentially. It's like bringing forth to knowledge almost. It's I don't know. At least I see it as a part of coming to consciousness, to bringing something into consciousness as a cure that, I don't know, cures your symptom or something like that.
But so if you say that over at the Lacan server, you're going to get rebuked because the lingo of making the unconscious conscious is like taboo. Like the unconscious unconscious knowledge is sexuality, is the truth of the unconscious is sexuality for Lacan, and the truth of sexuality is that it's a lack in being. Like sometimes the cure in psychoanalysis for Lacan is realizing that the big other is also lacking. It's like acceptance and commitment therapy, but for your lack.
Yeah, but I don't know. I'm not super well read in Freud by any means, but well, I mean, what I described, that's Freudian therapy, though, right?
In what they're talking about in Anti-Oedipus?
No, in terms of what I was talking about, to bringing the repressions to a consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, so the talking cure came out of that one case study, and he described, and it was also described as like a thorough chimney sweeping. What was the case study? Yeah, it might have been Dora. Or the other one. But I mean, I honestly think the cure is in what psychoanalysis is not a I mean, it's not a monolith. So yeah, definitely some circles, it's and definitely in psychodynamics today, they talk about the cure making the unconscious conscious.
Yeah, that's a quote from Jung, actually, even.
Yeah.
But I think in this case, at least, I think, I mean, for Deleuze and Guattari, in terms of the main thesis of the book, the cure is the repression for them, right? That's why they have the concept of the double bind, which they take it as, you have two undesirable options. You either go full alienation, or you pass on your Oedipus complex to everyone else, right? And they almost affirm all the concepts of psychoanalysis, except they pose the question of genealogy, asking where these come from. And in this regard, I mean, it is to say, as I think it's said before, but it is a process. Schizoanalysis is a process of curing you from the cure in that regard.
Yeah, and I like that definition. I like the contrast too between Freud and Lacan, because that I think Ken's probably right about that, right? The cure is not monolithic, whether it's Jung, Freud, or Lacan, or some other psychotherapeutic school. But I think we're starting to see some common elements here in terms of like making the unconscious conscious, of a talking cure, and of the role of the analyst and the analyzed, which might set us up for looking at how schizoanalysis kind of deviates, particularly in this so-called primitive culture.
Before we go on, I just wanted to say that, it's interesting reading Looking Awry, because in there, he talks about there being 3 stages to the analysis process in Lacan's work. And I'm not exactly sure what they are, but I'm going to venture, what I remember is something like the first one, I think, was interpretation, and the second one is traversing the fantasy, and the third one is the synthome. Is that right, Hermes? Ken?
I don't know if I've read enough Lacan to make that judgment.
Well, this is from Zizek interpreting Lacan.
Yeah. So I've only read almost 6 seminars now. I mean, interpretation definitely comes in there. Like and it's given this sort of primacy sometimes, where like you have to find the perfect moment for the interpretation, and sometimes what that interpretation does is get one to traverse one's fantasy and then that leads one into like a subjective destitution, and then from there you can create your own. The idea is that you can create your own master signifier. I believe I'll need to look at the structure of the analyst again, but I believe that's the end result. Is the product is a new master signifier.
So the way Zizek presents it is that, the interpretation didn't work, and so then he came up with the fantasy, traversing the fantasy, and that didn't work. So he came up with the synthome idea. So basically, he's going through symbolic, imaginary, and real in these different stages of the unfolding of his theory, and then the impression I get is that this is all a blaming the victim kind of strategy. That since none of these things worked, basically the theory is casuistry explaining why none of these things work. In other words, they're saying that it's inevitable that it's not going to work.
Well, the whole method is reductive in nature. It's an analytic reductive method.
Reductive how?
I mean, just quite generally, and in the way you were just talking about how you find a cause for the thing, and now the thing has it isn't seen as significant anymore. I mean, if we go back on the language we've been using, like traversing the fantasy, realizing the lack in your being. I mean, I guess the only one that doesn't fit into that necessarily is a new master signifier, but that master signifier comes about from subjective destitution, which is the symbolic, sort of breaking down. And Zizek gives a nice example of that, doesn't he, in that one crucifixion movie. But it's reductive in this way. So instead of like amplifying the thing like Jung would do, where he would personify some sort of ego dystonic affect and like try to make it its own person and then have a conversation with it. That's not, realizing the lack in your being or something like that.
So someone's typing. Could they mute themselves, please?
No, it's in my background. My wife and I share the same room, and she's working.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It's okay.
I mean, I think with regards to thinking about paralogisms in this way, you're going to have to can you give me your argument again? I'm kind of a bit confused. I mean, the third paralogism, at least the way they talk about it, is in terms of the incorrect usage of the conjunctive synthesis of consummation. It's a biunivocalization, right, rather than a nomadic and polyvocal. So I say, the whole idea of I'm of a superior race rather than I am everyone and I have been everyone, right? Rather than I've gone through the deliriums of all history by being affected by these intensities. Instead, I'm only this one person.
Yeah, I think I can.
They're traversing the fantasy.
I'm sorry?
I think what you just described comes under traversing the fantasy for Lacan.
Sorry, I was talking about the paralogism, the third paralogism in the case of Anti-Oedipus.
No, I understand that, but I was just saying that the idea that that you are the whole thing of being thinking you're a king, thinking you're Napoleon, all that's traversing the fantasy.
Yeah, I don't know much about. I'm not that well read in Lacan, so can't say or argue with that. Then.
But that's not really what I heard Varun saying. What I heard Varun saying is, or like I guess advocating for, is allowing yourself to be affected by these intensities instead of calling them fantasies, sort of.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's one of the things, the points they're trying to make with the correct use is that it's non-segregative. The thing about a biunivocalization is that it's a segregation, essentially. The biunivocalization is to say two things under one voice. I think that's the example that Brooks likes to give. But in terms of biunivocalization, that's also what they say. I think they also talk about racism as an example of this, right? That you say, I'm of the superior race, I'm of one race, rather than the schizo revolutionary who goes and he associates himself with intensities because he's got, I don't know, they compare it to the zero, right? So he's got a greater degree as opposed to the full zero of catatonia. And it is the sense that, oh, maybe then there is a connection about racism and stuff. But the whole thing about the schizo polyvocal nomadic synthesis is that they're able to consummate all intensities and then they associate with it, right? So I'm becoming a woman, or I don't know. They give an example of I'm becoming Negro as well. And these are considered actualities for those in guitar because they judge things based on affectivity, and in that sense of affectivity, it's not segregative, as opposed to the racist sort of use.
Yeah, and I think I can explain. I think so. First of all, I agree with what you're saying about the the paralogism is biunivocality and that. And I went back and I think it's chapter 2, section 6. Yeah, near the end, so like the reason I wrote about the third paralogism in the chat is because when Ken was describing a master signifier, that to me sounds like a third paralogism. And the reason I think that goes back to chapter 2, section 6, where they write, and this is page 111 in the Penguin. So they start out with, like, whence the third paralogism, the paralogism of application, which fits as the precondition for Oedipus by establishing a set of biunivocal relations between the determinations of the social field and the familial determinations, thereby making possible and inevitable the reduction of libidinal investments to the eternal daddy-mommy. So, right, this is very much what Varun was just describing. And then they go on to say the three errors concerning desire are called lack, law, and signifier. It is one and the same error in idealism that forms a pious conception of the unconscious. So you can already see, right, the third error seems to be signifier. They continue.
Well, I think we need to be careful, though. I mean, in terms of signifiers, they have a whole system of signification too, right? In terms of, and that system of signification for them is the body without organs. And whether you're living in, where you're talking about associates and stuff, where it is created by the debt relations of anti-production, or it's created by anti-production in desiring production. In the sense that essentially, it's a form of coding, right? So the bachelor who's not able to just randomly sleep with the girl next door. The married man who's not able to sleep with the girl next door. That's a form of signification playing a role in desire and production, right? And could you just restate your argument almost?
Yeah, let me read you the final point from that section. They continue. From the moment desire is made to depend on the signifier, it is put under the yoke of a despotism whose effect is castration. There where one recognizes the stroke of the signifier itself. But the sign of desire is never signifying. It exists in the thousands of productive break flows that never allow themselves to be signified with the unary stroke of castration. It is always a point sign of many dimensions, polyvocity as the basis for punctual semiology. And later on, they talk a little bit more about what schizoanalysis should do. But basically what I'm saying is, like, it sounds to me that what Ken and Kent have described in terms of Lacan and the master signifier is very much this this point where desire is made to depend on the signifier being put back under the yoke of a despotism. That is to say, like, it sounds to me like what Lacan is saying is, like, maybe you don't, well, what Hermes said about Lacan, to be fair, is that, right, maybe you don't need Oedipus, but you need this master signifier by which to sort of like demarcate the reality you're going to demarcate the psychological you're going to deal with, right? The social and psychic. I suppose Lacan might not say the real, but
it'd be information.
To the information would work. Experience, social, psychic, content.
I would say that it's that would go with the illegitimate use of the disjunctive synthesis, or the paralogism of the disjunctive synthesis, right? Because it's the exclusive and restrictive rather than the inclusive and non-restrictive, and that's essentially like that's a despotic signifier on the body without organs in a way, or a double mind, for example, or even like one of the things that they talk about in terms of the Oedipus complex, of how Oedipus complex occurs, is with when anti-production basically records a repressive representation, right? When there's the recording or the Oedipus code on the body without organs, that the repressing representation that gets recorded on the body without organs, right? The Oedipus code that forces desire into certain locales, or pushes desire into certain variations.
Yeah, and I think that's why these three paralogisms seem to be caught up in each other. But the reason I think it's the point of signification is more directly in the third, here at least, is because they're making the distinction between the third error, which is the signifier, in contrast to the point sign having many dimensions and a polyvocity. And for the second synthesis, it's a difference between the syllogism of commandment and the paralogism of law, which either way still gets into what you're talking about in terms of recording and how that recording, sort of like what it does. And those are pages 111 to 112 for anyone who's interested. And the second synthesis is talked about page 110. But actually, in terms of a cure, this might be interesting for our discussion too. The practical problem of schizoanalysis is then to ensure the contrasting reversion, restoring the syntheses of the unconscious to their imminent use.
Yeah, that's essentially that. It's not a transcendent use. It's they have that pretty much outlined Kantian critique from at least the three syntheses, right? The term synthesis comes from, if you remember, synthetic unity of apperception and all that stuff from Kantian terminology. But with regards to Kant, it's like the reason they say it's a correct use, or the reason they say that it's a syllogism, or the reason they say that it's an imminent use, is because they've basically tried to find the real transcendental conditions. At least my hypothesis is that the way desire works, if you read it, I think I was talking about this earlier also, but if you read it, through Deleuze's reading of Maimon and places like difference and repetition and stuff, my hypothesis is that desire works in the same way that reason works for Kant, in the sense that desire is productive. And so from Maimon's reading, Maimon challenged Kant, asking him to say that he had to give an account for how reason can be genetic or productive as well. And so that's part of what Deleuze is doing with Deleuze and Guattari. They're doing with desire being productive, and it produces the conditions of the unconscious itself, and hence they find immanent criteria, right? So they say it's the transcendent criteria that creates lack, or it creates forms of repression, or it creates errors, and they're going to analyze, at least in the social field, how these transcendent criteria or incorrect criteria come to bear. So I see the role of schizoanalysis as being, you could almost see it implicit, as Lyotard says. You can see an implicit critique of Marx here, right? Right. They're concerned about how it needs to be structured on immanent criteria, and they're not. I mean, and then so they're going to structure the whole social field almost on the correct immanent uses of the unconscious, rather than structuring the social field in the sense of, I don't know, equality for society.
Yeah, and I think that actually gets toward like a two-step basic idea of a cure here, and one of them being to preserve or restore a sort of syllogistic level for the three syntheses, right? To take them away from a paralogism and restore them. And then the second part being, like you were talking about with the social field, and we're going to see this in what the shaman does, right? Or we've already seen what the shaman does, is looking at the social connection and context that is engaging, and even in some sense the territorializings related to those three syntheses. I think that might be where we start to get at like what schizoanalysis takes as a cure, or at least what a cure for schizoanalysis might begin to look like.
Yeah, I think there's a great line in 1,000 Plateaus. If you read the Body Without Organs chapter, right, they say, where psychoanalysis says, stop, we haven't found ourselves yet. Schizoanalysis says, no, go forth, continue the process. We haven't found our body without organs yet. But it is sort of like a pushing to a limit, right? The schizophrenic limit, that is.
Yeah, definitely not the Oedipal limit. But with that, I was going to say maybe we want to move into what the shaman does to start looking at. Because I think that is one of the main things for this book, right? Is like, what is schizoanalysis? What does it do? Does anybody have any other thoughts before we move into what the passage on the shaman? Any questions or remarks at this point?
Yeah, I mean, these recap sessions should be to ask questions from any part of the book. So that would help us, actually.
Well, I just want to mention that I mentioned Zizek's interpretation of Lacan's cure, and I see it as kind of casuistry for the fact that he doesn't have a cure; it doesn't work, so the point of, to my mind, the point of this whole chapter, trying to keep the, kind of forest type view instead of getting lost in the trees, is that the whole names of the father thing in Lacan doesn't work. And I think what's interesting about their approach is that they're continually saying, oh, Lacan's all right, but it's all of his followers that got it wrong. Well, names of the father is a core Lacanian concept. And even though they say, oh, the followers got it wrong and Lacan didn't, actually they're taking a swipe at him. And I see it as a kind of counter trick to the tricks of Lacan in the sense that they knew they were going to take him in. And they did take him in because, Deleuze recounts this meeting he has with Lacan where after Lacan makes him wait for a long time, Lacan summons him, and after making him wait for a long time, he says to him, well, all of my followers got it wrong. Really, who I need is you. So he saw Deleuze as his key follower, at least according to Deleuze's report.
Yeah, I think Dan Smith wrote about that as well. Yeah, I think even in Lacan's lectures, he did a lot of lectures on Deleuze's book Coldness on Cruelty, and his book on masochism and stuff like that.
And Deleuze did make a advance there because I read a part where Lacan was saying that sadism and masochism were complementary opposites, whereas Deleuze says they're not, and gives a really good argument why they are not, as most people think, the inverse of each other.
I wanted to say too, Kent, to your point, I've noticed that as well, where they'll say Deleuze and Guattari will write things like, after Lacan loosened the bolts of Oedipus, why do his followers tighten them? Or actually, in this chapter, in this very section 4, they'll write, and this is a very curious part too, because they only give Lacan so much credit. They write something like, did the followers of Lacan Oedipolize his doctrine? And in that way, sometimes it seems to me like the progress Lacan made seems to also be like in preservation of something. So like I said earlier, it seems to say like, well, maybe we don't need Oedipus, right? But you do need this master signifier. And like that doesn't have to be Oedipus, but it still seems to construct a kind of like what I was saying was the third paralogism, but like the same problem of a despotic signifier, or like, as we're going to see in this section, right, a representation that takes us away from what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of hits aimed at Jacques Lacan, like Miller and people like that. I think Miller has a reputation for being like a super dogmatic Lacanian and stuff. And I think, I think there is a real controversy even in inner Lacanian circles with Miller and stuff like that. So yeah, you may be on something. That's the thing.
Well, it just strikes me that they're constantly saying, no, Lacan got it all right, but his followers messed up. But actually, they're attacking the whole name of the Father. They're basically saying, if you go back and look what the shamans did, the whole name of the Father, their doctrine doesn't make any sense, because basically what the shamans are doing is that they actually take into account the whole lineage and the place in society of the person they're curing. They just don't talk about the mother and the father.
Yeah, and it's curious that they call Lacan's ideas a doctrine, right? So like, there's a way in which they give Lacan credit distinct from his followers, and then there's a way that they seem to also sort of attack Lacan in some ways, or at least, and I think this is what we've been focused on in this discussion. There's a way that Lacan's ideas still pose a paralogism, or a way of sort of afflicting these three syntheses. There's still a need for schizoanalysis even with Lacan, whether or not his followers are in the room.
So from the point of view of this cure question, which I think is a very good question, to me the whole thing kind of revolves around whether this valorization of schizophrenia that the Deleuze and Guattari do is the same as the idea of the synthome, which is the fact, kind of enjoy your own symptom, that there is no cure. You just have to learn to live with it. And
I was just going to put an addendum to that. There is no cure from the lack of one's being.
Sorry, say it again.
There is no cure from the lack of one's being.
Right, but you have to assume that that's true. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari are denying that.
Yeah.
The lack of want something positive.
I think that's where the fundamental difference is, possibly between them, is that, Lacan thinks that the lack of being is, functionally incurable. And so, like you're saying, it's to kind of learn how to enjoy the symptom of one's lack of being. Whereas Deleuze and Guattari don't take up that position, so therefore maybe there can be a cure for whatever's going on.
Yeah, and that might be a great point to launch into this this discussion of the shaman, as I think we're already beginning to. So, right, like this discussion of so right, we've talked about like there's primitive cures, plural, which is interesting too. It's not the cure, it's the cures that are schizoanalysis and in action. And so they give us this story about a medicine man and a soothsayer diagnosing and warring off the effects of the incisior, launching into a social analysis concerning the territory and its environs, the chieftainship and its sub-chieftainships. That's a mouthful. The lineages and their segments, the alliances and the affiliations. They constantly bring to light desire in its relations with political and economic units. The very point on which, moreover, the witnesses try to mislead them. So, like, one thing I'm already getting out of this is like schizoanalysis doesn't take the person as being sick. It seems to think there's a larger disruption in the social field that just happens to be, this person happens to be one of the people stepping forth to say something about it.
So we should keep in mind, Levi-Strauss's differentiation between the bricoleur and the engineer, which in this case would be, the shaman and the medical doctor.
Yeah, in that sense too, like in what we described in terms of Lacan and the Freudian, and even I think what we can say about the Jungian, I don't see them going so far as to say, like, we've got to do something. This sounds to me like part of schizoanalysis is saying we've got to do something about society, and look at the territories and the structures, and, something's amiss socially, and this person is just, just one instantiation of it, right? As opposed to, like, I think psychoanalysis is much more individual, right? Where it's less about what's awry socially, and it's more about, what's going on in your head, so to speak, whether or not, Oedipus is on the table, right? It's at a personal level, not a social level.
I would want to add on to that and say that maybe it's not necessarily about an individual versus social thing, that it's more about their opinions on, macrosystemic culture. Maybe the psychoanalysts, including Freud, including Jung, don't think about changing the social circumstances.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up because I want to quote Foucault in his introduction. Foucault writes, and this is part of his bullet point list of how not to live a fascist life. But Foucault writes, "Do not demand of politics that it restores the so-called rights of the individual as philosophy has defined them. The individual is the product of power. What is needed is to so-called de-individualize by means of multiplication and displacement, diverse combinations. The group must not be the organic bond uniting hierarchicalized individuals, but a constant generator of de-individualization." And I think it's... Oh, good.
And I think that's Nietzscheanism. that's one of the big parts of Nietzscheanism of this book, is the problem with the group dynamics that I think they're trying to criticize in a way, right? It's that sense that I mean, it's the sense that that's why we have, right, a socius or social production, because organized, and they even talk about this in terms of studying history through contingencies and stuff like that, and these assemblages, in the sense that essentially we need to understand that, you know, if we have a group formation, we can't study the group. It's almost like complexity theory, right? Or nonlinear dynamics, like difference and repetition, right? So if we have a group, we can't study the group by just taking out the individual parts. There's this gestalt aspect to it, like that we need to look at the relationships that are formed in between these group dynamics, that the group plays a much larger. The parts don't add up to the whole of the group, right? The group plays a much larger role, and you know, it goes back to the whole idea that there are flows everywhere. These flows get moved, and these material fluxes get changed and stuff. So it's the group dynamics that, you know, that people latch onto, and it influences each other. So it's a very Nietzschean thesis that they have. They want to sort of get rid of this in a way. I mean, I want to get rid of this, but almost fix this scenario that's in place.
Well, and look at what Foucault is prescribing here. Look at what he's saying the group should be. The group must, quote, the group must not be the organic bond uniting hierarchized individuals, but a constant generator of de-individualization. End quote, which I think is exactly what you're describing, in the sense that if we're going to look at groups and do group analysis, we're talking about generating de-individualization, as opposed to using the group to unite hierarchy and therefore to individualize under hierarchy, right? And I think this medicine man example of schizoanalysis, I think that's kind of a little bit of what they're showing here.
So, you know, it's pretty hard to understand what's going on in these other cultures, you know, these more primitive cultures, talking about shaman. But if you transpose that into, you know, the Western society, then you have the relationship between allopathy and homeopathy, for instance. And in America, the American Medical Association spent a lot of time trying to destroy homeopathy and saying it was a kind of shamanism. But then an interesting thing happened, which was acupuncture came up. And so a lot of these doctors went to China and watched people being operated on with no anesthetics, just using the Chinese would use acupuncture in surgeries. And so there was this existential proof that something was working in acupuncture, even though they didn't know how to do it. But since something was working in acupuncture, even though they didn't understand it, they decided to allow the licensing of acupuncture, whereas they had suppressed homeopathy. So, you know, if you take acupuncture and homeopathy as kind of like the Western examples, well-documented Western examples of something like a shamanistic approach, you know, holistic medicine, more or less, then you can kind of like apply this this analysis they're doing to something concrete that we know more about that's part of our culture.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I struggle though too, is though I think this example is here to show us something that might actually be missing in our culture, right? This idea that, because this sounds to me very much like what the medicine man is doing here with the soothsayer, especially if there's two people doing this. That's already kind of unique. But it looks to me like what they're doing is they're going through all these they're going through all the territorializings. They're talking to different people in the society. They're doing something fully immersive at that level of like, just like Foucault said, actually, I think they're de-individualizing. Well, if there is any individualizing going on here, they're de-individualizing the group and they're looking at this collectivity to look at what's gone, I think, what the symptoms are in the social field at that level of what seems to be impeding the three syntheses in that manner.
Well, the thing that is like that in homeopathy is the miasm, that there is intergenerational transmission of disease in homeopathy. Basically, homeopathy had the same problem, that, it used the placebo effect. And what's interesting is that the studies that differentiate the placebo effect, I can't remember the numbers, but there's only like 5 percentage points difference between placebo and causality in a lot of studies. But they ran into the same problem, is that using the placebo effect, they could not, there were a whole bunch of patients they could not cure. And so Hahnemann came up with the idea of the miasms as a way of dealing with that problem. And what's interesting is that the miasms are very similar to the 3 anamorphic objects in Lacan and Zizek.
Yeah, but even that doesn't sound quite like this example where like the medicine man is dealing with somebody who's struggling with not being like when we look at this language, and this is somebody they're quoting, divination becomes a form of social analysis in the course of which hidden struggles between individuals and factions are brought to light in such a way that they can be treated by traditional ritual methods. The vague nature of mystical beliefs allowing them to be manipulated in relation to a great number of social situations. End quote. It seems that the pathological incisor is indeed mainly that of the maternal grandfather, but the latter was a great chief. His successor, the so-called real chief, had to relinquish the throne for fear of being bewitched, and his would-be heir, intelligent and ambitious, does not exercise the power. The actual chief is not the real chief. As for the sick K, the person who went to the medicine man, he has not been able to assume the role of mediator that could have made him a candidate for chief. Everything becomes, and then they move into how colonialization kind of destroys this. But at this level of social analysis, where it seems to me that the schizoanalysis is looking at the different structures and territorializings in the society, and like uncovering what's going on in the alliant and the affiliative, and uncovering what's going on with these syntheses here, and trying to figure out like where the congestion is and how it reached this person, and this broader social problem. That seems to me to be a major element of what this cure for schizoanalysis is going to look like, especially in terms of like the unconscious.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's just that the problem is, they picked out one example from the anthropological literature that was like what they what they foresaw as being, more like schizoanalysis. But there's a whole bunch of cultures out there. What they do in terms of shamanism and folk medicine are all very, very different from each other. And so, it's hard, and the cultural barrier is almost insurmountable because we don't know the language, we don't know a lot of times the anthropological reports are not reliable. So I'm just saying that if we translate it into the problems we have in medicine today, in physical medicine, you can see that the same kinds of problems and distinctions exist in our own culture, which we can understand more readily. And like for instance, the what's interesting about it is that the shaman, say the homeopathist or the acupuncturist, because they're like the bricoleur, and the engineer is like the doctor of medicine with an MD, but there's overreach and excess in the medical system. If you went into it, there'd be like a lot of the deaths that occur are because of medication that is wrongly prescribed. There's just unnecessary surgeries. I mean, you could go on and on about the ill side effects of modern medicine. But modern medicine says that, what we do works because we have these studies that back it up. But then if you look at the studies, the difference between what they consider causal and what's placebo is only a few percentage points. So there's a whole kind of mess here in our own system that we could look at just to see this same kind of thing. And then we can wonder, well, what would schizoanalysis do in that situation? Well, one thing it would do is it would take into account the family situation, not just concentrate on the person who has the mental illness.
Yeah, and I think what I'm getting at is like this example should point us toward what you're saying, right? So like if we want to talk about like what schizoanalysis would do today, right? At this level, it seems to me that, like schizoanalysis takes on a social analysis rather than a purely individual analysis. It's tracing the flows and break flows and the different structures and territorializings that are part of the social field. And therefore it's kind of like Foucault said, it's not about trying to individualize these things. And if there are paralogisms or problems, it's not about trying to individualize those problems or assign them to anybody per se. It's about trying to de-individualize and look at what's going on with the group and these the way that things like supposing there is a despot signifier, looking how that's affecting people in the society and not just the person, right? So it's not the analyzed as the person, it's all these different people. So it's almost to me like schizoanalysis is taking the point of departure to be the social field.
Yeah, I agree with that 100. I would add on though. I mean, so yeah, definitely, it's about social analysis in a way whereas everything's always plugged into the social field, and hence we get a primacy to social repression. You see that in anti-psychiatry too, like R.D. Laing and stuff. It's almost like, I mean, what they were saying is there's almost something aristocratic about their viewpoint, right? It goes back to that whole idea to be great is to be misunderstood and all that Nietzscheanism. I think also what we need to consider is this aspect that, and it's going back to this idea of groups, right? Another big influence, big part of this was the work Felice Guattari did with Jean Oury in Laborde, right? Group fantasies and subject groups and subjugated groups. He did a lot of group theory work with Sartre, taking theories from Sartre and Heidegger, and understanding how a subject group is a group that's always risking its breaking apart, but it's always open to the outside field. And it's not hierarchicized like a subjugated group that has a strict leader, right? Like, so a military official. But a subject group constructs its own sort of group fantasies, while the subjugated group is subjugated essentially by a veritable leader. And that's part of it. I think the thing is that essentially it is revolutionary, because if you consider the social field as well as, you can't just change the individual, you have to change the social field itself. That's part of the analysis. The analysis is to change the social field, and it is very much connected almost in a rhizomatic way to the political economy, and hence there is something very political about this book. It's revolutionary charged in the sense that the schizo is the revolutionary for them, and you see that all coming out in terms of their analysis. Lacan has no potential for revolution, but it's teeming in schizoanalysis. It's just overflowing in schizoanalysis.
Yeah, and if we walk that back to what Kent was saying about, so let's look at our modern society, right? One thing we can do that I think schizoanalysis does do, here we go. And they actually write this: the discovery of desires and conscious investments of the social field, right? So we look at the revolutionary and reactionary investments, the cathesis going on of desire and production. So right after they do this consideration of the sort of a primitive schizoanalysis, they move into what a barrier for doing this in our society would be, which is the Oedipalization, right? And I think this is we got a little bit farther than this yesterday, but that seemed to be where we left off, trying to understand, at least, was this larger point about Oedipalization and the barrier for that, the barrier that Oedipalization and even things like the incest prohibition, so right, social and psychic repression, the challenges that pose to something like schizoanalysis. But maybe before we move that, are there other thoughts on what we've talked about so far, or does anybody want to ask questions or go somewhere else in the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, this is open to saying pretty much anything about anything, because you can bring up anything from the whole book. At least it's better if we do that, because that's what we do in the recap sessions.
Crickets. So then, I guess it's time to talk about Oedipus, right? Because we don't do that enough, do we? So I guess to review, right, they start out by saying that what was strange for them about looking at this interpretation of the medicine man is that at first they thought it was going to be Oedipal. Right there, we said the point of departure seemed Oedipal. It was only the point of departure for us, conditioned to say Oedipus every time someone speaks to us, the father, mother, grandfather. So we're starting out with this problem of and this is kind of like what Varun was saying yesterday in terms of it's a problem when you don't even, it's a problem when you think Oedipus isn't real, right? But on the flip side, it's also a problem if you don't realize Oedipus, right? If you don't realize that there is an Oedipalization, it seems to me that even Deleuze and Guattari here seem to be saying we're so suspicious of Oedipus that this take even looked Oedipal to us.
Yeah, exactly. It just goes to show how deeply ingrained all this stuff is. I was actually kind of lost. I think I did some ruminating on this for a while, and I think I have a theory, at least, for what they mean by the fact that they say that it would be incorrect to assume that Oedipus is off the prohibition of incest, and the nuance that they're attacking here, in the sense that, so I think we need to be, so at least when I was first reading this, I thought, oh, so as soon as you come out of chapter 2, you realize, oh, so it's the prohibition of incest, right? That's where it happens. But now they talk about something else. They say it would be incorrect to go from the prohibition of incest to assume Oedipus in that regard. So I thought that was interesting. So at least my take on that is that essentially, in savage societies, it's safe to assume, at least this is what Holland says also, it's it's already Oedipalized. We're already in an Oedipalized perspective to look at these, it's a form of ethnocentrism in a way, to look at you look at savage societies and you conclude that the prohibition of incest is negative, right? To make that conclusion is a form of ethnocentrism, and for a savage society, the portion of incest can be productive in that regard, and in the sense that it's causing people to basically combine with other families or more affiliative relationships. But more importantly, is it safe to assume that in a certain situation, right, they didn't have a nuclear family there, and at least the family was structured in a different way. So, I mean, intensities were structured in a different way. So it's safe to say maybe at that point in time, the prohibition of incest didn't cause that. The way the entire society was structured was differently. So we can't assume every time from the prohibition of incest something like that happened. So in that social situation, it's something else in the prohibition of incest.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that, man. I think I blew a fuse or something.
Did you hear what I said?
I heard.
I caught a quarter of it, so I might have to ask you to repeat.
It's funny because when you came back, you're much louder.
Lucky you. You have no choice but to listen to me.
Should I repeat that? I don't know if everyone else wants to listen to that long ramble.
Okay, so I'd just like to reset for a moment and say that we keep talking about the incest taboo like it really was something, and because everyone's they're making such a big deal out of it. So I mean, I think it's worthwhile remembering that the whole point of the incest taboo in patriarchal society is so that the patriarchs know who they're.
Hang on.
We just lost power.
Oh, looks like they just lost power.
Yep, lost power.
You lost power, but you're still on. That's amazing.
Like I said, lucky you.
So anyway, to just continue, so I mean, I'm trying to go back to basics here. Basics are the reason that the incest taboo is there is so that the patriarchs know whose children are theirs, so the patriarchy can continue. So controlling women is all about knowing whose children they're having. Now, the thing about the incest taboo is that there are these corner cases in it, like, father-daughter and mother-son incest. So it turns out just statistically, there's a lot more father-daughter incest than there is mother-son. If it happens, even when they estimate the incidents, non-reported incidents, it's very small compared to father-daughter. And so, everyone's you constantly hear in these conversations where people are talking about having sexual relations with their mothers, as if that's on people's mind. But it's not true. It's not on people's mind. And it's a very rare phenomena, even in our society. So, I think it's just worth kind of remembering that when we're talking about this, because basically this is a perversion of Freudian psychology. This whole idea of Oedipus being about everyone wanting to kill their fathers and go to bed with their mothers. This is a perversion of Freud taken up by Lacan. And Deleuze and Guattari are rightly attacking it because it has no basis. Even in myth, it is the normal case is the hero's initiation. Oedipus is, according to Gao, in Oedipus the Philosopher, it's an anomaly that people fail the hero's initiation and then they become philosophers like Oedipus. So, I just think we need to keep these things in mind so that the attack is worthy, and it's worth attacking this because it's not it's not a reality. It's a very rare anomaly. But Freud and Lacan made it like it was everything. And basically Deleuze and Guattari are going through and saying, no, it's not everything. It doesn't even exist, really.
I think no, but in terms of like within an ontological status of Oedipus, I don't. Yeah, in terms of the thing, it's that it's almost virtual, right? As they say, it's in the it's a potential in a way, in the sense that the problem is that it never needed to happen, but it happened. And somehow we suffer from this very special delirium, or it never had to happen, but somehow these desires were created.
Right, but they're acted out very rarely, and most people don't have them. So, the thing is that we just need to keep this in mind, that something. What happened was that Freud decided to, in order to gain fame, concentrate on sexuality, which was a taboo to talk about. And so he talked about it. So of course everyone was interested. But he had these very perverse ideas where he projected adult desires on children. And that became a kind of a fad in our society. And so, and Lacan took up that fad and kind of critiqued it, did a kind of deconstruction of Freudianism, but kept many of the central tenets and made them worse in some way by this whole idea of lack being ontological. And and so Deleuze and Guattari are rightly attacking that, but it doesn't mean, just because it's a fad in our society doesn't mean there's any reality to it on the ground.
Yeah, but isn't one of the problems though the fact that desire can be controlled so easily? In terms of the desires, that desire keeps getting almost manipulated so easily, right? Indicates that, and I think part of their point is that there is a problem of Oedipalization in that regard.
Well, I think that their point about repression is there's plenty of repression happening. The fact that it's all interpreted through Oedipus by psychoanalysis is a perversion, but just naturally there is a lot of repression occurring, because that's Nietzsche's all for repression. It's what's civilized as far as Nietzsche's concerned.
What do you mean by naturally, though? I feel like I feel like that's something Deleuze and Guattari might disagree with, actually.
What? Say it again.
What do you mean by naturally? Like repression is naturally? That seems Freudian almost. That repression is naturally. Repression is natural.
Well, I think if you look around at any society, some kind of repression is going on. That's what I mean. I don't mean that it happens out of nature.
Yeah, that's the whole thing where social repression is primary.
So
now, I think they're right about that, and I think that that's what we should look at. And the fact that it's constellated by psychoanalysis into Oedipus is a kind of like marginal phenomena. But if you really want to, that's why I think that Foucault's refocusing on fascism in the in the preface was very helpful. At least it was helpful for me, because this book really is about fascism in general, and that repression that's kind of like in every society, it has a fascistic kind of if it's taken to an extreme, it becomes a fascism.
Do Deleuze and Guattari talk about any difference between repression and sort of just filtering one's experience, like how the mind filters out perception to make I don't know, something coherent?
What do you mean? What do you mean by? Sorry, can you mean by filtering? What do you mean by filtering?
So like one phenomena of it is the Tea Party effect, where like you can hear your name being called, or like right now, me being able to shift my focus from the sound, the video game sound, to like trying to talk about and hear myself talk about this. Because like there's like a trauma theory thread to the Oedipus, and that's like, I guess, would be psychic repression, but I still don't see how you would delineate that from social repression, because like the trauma comes from a social relationship or whatever, and then from the institutionalization of that nuclear family social relationship. But I mean, there's clearly a difference between the way the mind tries to make coherent an overwhelming experience by like reducing it down to size, and between like social, like fascistic repression. So I was just wondering if Deleuze and Guattari talked about that, if they make that difference at all, because that seems to be different from how they talk about psychic and social repression, and that it's not quite repression, but it can be conflated with it.
I think that is a theme, more of a theme in Logic of Sense and Difference and Repetition than it is here.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what Leibniz said, minute perceptions and stuff like that, he talks about that pretty explicitly in Difference and Repetition, actually, right? That there are all these minute perceptions in these, and the way the cognition process all that. That's a whole nother discussion, and that goes into passive synthesis, where the subject is placed in time rather than time being placed in the subject. But I don't know. I've not seen that much of that in Anti-Oedipus yet, at least in my regard.
And it would be helpful if they had discussed that here. It would have been helpful, because that, I mean, basically there's a kind of filtering that goes on. Like, for instance, if you're in a coffee shop and you're talking to someone, you filter out all the other noise so that you can hear the person. And that, for instance, if you have hearing aids, the microphones can't do that kind of filtering. And so the people I've heard, because I have friends who have this problem, that people with hearing aids, they have a hard time having talks and conversations in coffee shops. So that kind of filtering, which is kind of like, more biologically based, is different from repression. Repression is when you have some kind of natural urge, natural in quotes, and you try to distract from that or deny it, or other people deny it.
Oh, go ahead, Ken.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it might help, and I apologize if everyone already went over this. It might be worth looking at some of the things they write on page 172 and 173, because I think their main point is that we shouldn't let the representation be taken as the repression. We shouldn't confuse the two in the same way that Marxism would say we shouldn't confuse value with price. It seems to me an extremely similar point. So they write at the bottom of 172, and this is something altogether different. The general social repression, psychic repression, gives rise to an Oedipal image as a disfiguration of the repressed. The fact that this image, in turn, finally suffers a repression, that it comes to take the place of the repressed or of the thing that is effectively desired, insofar as sexual repression is directed at something other than incest. Such is the long history of our society. But the repressed is not first of all the Oedipal representation. What is repressed is desiring production. It is the part of this production that does not enter into social production or reproduction. It is what would introduce disorder and revolution into the socius, the non-coded flows of desire. The part that passes, on the contrary, from desiring production to social production forms a direct sexual investment of this social production, without any repression of a sexual nature of the symbolism and the corresponding affects, and above all, without any reference to an Oedipal representation that could be held to be originally repressed or structurally foreclosed. The animal in us is not merely the object of a preconscious investment determined by interest, but the object of a libidinal investment of desire that only secondarily derives an image of the father from desiring production. So, like in a large sense, I think what they're basically getting at here is that desiring production is what's repressed socially, right, and psychically. And so Oedipus works as a representation, and the incest taboo, even in this society, I think, although certainly not in the same way, but the incest taboo seems to work as a way of repressing desiring production, and the Oedipal representation seems to be one of those agents of dispatch upon the family that they talked about, and I think it was 2.8.
Yeah, go over this.
Go ahead.
No, I'll go over this again, but like it's a semiotic system, what they have here, right? You have a signifier, which is the repressing representation. So in this scenario, it'll be the prohibition of incest, right? And then you have a displaced representative, which is the displaced representative is essentially the signified, which is the distorted image of desire produced by the representation itself. And so I don't know, for them it might be like Oedipus complex. And then you have the referent, or I think that what they are referring to as referent is the repressed representative, which is the real flow of desiring production, right? It's the flow of desiring production at that primordial, syllogistic, correct use of the synthesis level, right? So, what really gets repressed by the prohibition is completely different from the false image produced by the prohibition. So in desire, it's almost like it's placed onto an erroneous signified, and that's belonging to the prohibitive. It belongs to the prohibitive system of representation rather than desire itself. So it's instead of being like, it's not that you're repressed from the incest prohibition. Oedipalization is produced by it, and then it's repressed after that, after the desires. So after the repressing representation creates the desire, desire also gets repressed back at the third stage by that repression itself, because then you already have an incest prohibition on top of you to not do that, and so you repress it, right? And that's why they refer to it as a falsified image meant to trap desire. And I think one example of this is like, I gave it last time, right? It's the example of Buchanan gives this example too. It's that of it's that of sex before marriage, right? I think in the U.S. it was considered pretty degenerate to have sex before marriage, and it was frowned down upon. And essentially, but the desire to have sex before marriage was created. It's that prohibition that makes it possible for you to transgress now. And then it goes back to guilt, right? And so that's what you wanted. desire feels guilty. So that's what you wanted.
Yeah, and they conclude that paragraph writing, "We have already seen how the prohibition of incest referred not to Oedipus, but to the non-coded flows that constitute desire, and to their representative, the intense prepersonal flow. As for Oedipus, it is another way of coding the uncodable, of codifying what eludes the codes, or of displacing desire in its object, a way of entrapping them," which I think you've explained really well, right? But it means that, to add to that, again, we're seeing that fear of non-coded flows of desire and the way that that's going to have an intense prepersonal flow getting displaced onto Oedipus, the representative of that. It also speaks to, like, there's very clearly a fear that this is going to make its way to the socius. And it seems to me like a social repression, psychic repression at this level are very much about preserving something in the socius and trying to deal with a non-coded flow of desire that's actually being anticipated in some sense.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
I just want to mention that this phrase, the general social repression, psychic repression system, gives rise to the Oedipal image as a disfiguration of the repressed. You know, I would cling to that as evidence in the text that for what I was talking about before.
but I mean, I see them as saying that the desire is created, that essentially all his desires get created.
I see them saying the image, the sentence immediately following what Cameron is, the fact that this image in turn finally suffers a repression, that it comes to take the place of the repressed, or of the thing that is effectively desired, insofar as sexual repression is directed at something other than incest, such as a long history of our society. There's a way that this repression, this image goes into circulation. And I think that's what the struggle is here too, is like, I think I'm getting out of this that an Oedipal desire is not created, but the Oedipal representation goes into circulation as a paragolistic, or like as a signifier in this regard, even though the desiring production, what might be going on that moment is something like an alliant interest or something like that, like, although that would still be a form of codification. But because this is uncodified desire, it seems to me that this is a way of trying to codify it and deal with it in anticipation of some trouble it could cause. So that's kind of how I'm reading it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case to point is that essentially the representation is created, right? That the fact is but I think the key thing here, at least in my reading, is that the problem that they're responding to is the creation of desire, and desire desiring its own repression, right? It's desire that's going into locales that it really doesn't need to be going into. That's from the creation of the signifier or the image or whatever you want to call it. And in that regard, it's because anti-production, right? Anti-production, it frees it's anti-production allows the organism to essentially, I mean, you take the example of the schizophrenic table. As the table is being produced, it's a new thing can only be produced via if there is anti-production that first disjuncts them, and when that primary disjunction of anti-production occurs, that the problem is that it also records it, and these Oedipalized representations can also be recorded, and that's the big issue that we're dealing with here.
Yeah, and then it goes into circulation, right?
Yeah.
Or like the point of it becoming a signifier.
Yeah, I think that's the problem that they're trying to respond to.
Yeah, and in that sense too, like desire. So at the very end, I think I read this of displacing desire and its object, a way of entrapping them. right, it also seems to be a way of like not just trying to deal with uncoded flows, but trying to put them in a perimeter, or the triangle again. But like there seems to be this this fear that you've got to like preserve these structures and that by sort of foreclosing desiring production and that, and something like the Oedipal representation as a kind of psychic repression, and the taboo, the incest taboo is a larger social repression, seem to have that mutually enforcing relationship to do that. I do struggle with that myself, though. Like, does the idea of desire desiring its own repression, especially if desire is always revolutionary?
I mean, I think this whole idea of desire revolution, I think this is only going to come out a bit later, because they've barely talked about it until now. Until I think they're going to bring about it a little later. I think that's the goal of section 4. At least that's my assumption. I've not read it yet, but at least that's what I think was going to come out of it. In the sense that, yeah, they like to throw their bold, controversial statements out, but they don't talk much about it until a bit later. So I think we're going to see that come out a bit later too.
So there's an idea of a guy named Waddington, and I don't know how to pronounce it. It's like Geord or Geord. Anyway, what it is like a riverbed that is formed by multiple inundations and the river moving over time and so forth. And so there's this idea that when you do things over and over in a repetitive manner, they you kind of force down the same path. Things get aligned so that the easiest route is through the river channel, and then that channel is dynamic because it moves around. And so if we think about that in terms of this idea of the social and psychic repression, that basically that system is like that those riverbeds or those pathways of least resistance that get set up by society, and then Oedipus is this disfigured repression. It's setting up something which is an anomaly, that's an extreme case that allows the phenomena to be talked about, but is not the phenomena itself. And it's the extreme cases that always get the attention. And then if you think of the decoded flows as if you've got a flood, the water goes just everywhere. The channel gets forgotten, and a lot of times a new channel will be produced by a new flood. So the uncoded desires are like the floodwater.
Right. Yeah. The Socius can't codify it. It's basically too much. It's like the.
Yeah.
It's and like so, the. So it's like the opposite of the miraculating inscription, right? It's that. It's the other. It's like the paranoiac mission, where it can't be coded onto. It's just outflowing. Then I guess the thing is that. Yeah, I think we need to also remember, right? It's not. We need to both understand code and flow together, at least in terms of our examples, because we can't have. It's not that we have a flow first and we have a code on top of it. They're both coextensive with each other.
Mm-hmm. What do you guys make of this this statement? The animal in us is not merely the object of a preconscious investment determined by interest, but the object of a libidinal investment of desire that only secondarily derives an image of the father from desiring production.
Because it's talking about the other half of the myth where the sons kill the father. That's how the name of the father gets set up. The sons killed the father, and so it's the name of the father that becomes the none of the sons can take the place of the father, and so the name of the father becomes the sign under which the repression takes place in this Freudian mythology.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Because it looks like, to me, what I'm getting out of is like, so the animal in us, right? The body or the person. It's not that we're an object of a preconscious investment of interest, right? It's that we're a libidinal investment of desire, or that we're the object of a libidinal investment of desire. So, like, when desiring production is happening, it's not by a preconscious investment of desires. So, like with the father or with the mother, it's not like it's something preconscious that we're taking the object for. It's that libidinal investments of desire are taking those objects, and therefore something like the father and the image you just described, Kent. Those images are secondarily derived from the libidinal investments of desiring production.
So what's weird about this is that there is a kind of general mammalian instinctual plan, where some species the alpha male has a territory, and he has a harem within that territory that he tries to keep control of. And then the beta males come in and try to knock off the alpha male. There's a bimodal. There's these gamma males that don't compete for territory. They're just out in the wilds. And there's gamma type females that are not part of the. And so the interesting thing about that is that is kind of could be seen as the like basis of matriarchy, because the whole point of matriarchy is that reproduction is a scarce resource, so you can't afford to trade women around in an exchange network because it's too valuable resource. So the females are kept at home, and the husbands visit. And then patriarchy, the females go to the family of husband farmed. So it's like this mammalian instinctual pattern, and I don't know how widespread it is in man, to tell you the truth, but that pattern seems to be kind of like more the basis of matriarchy than patriarchy. And patriarchy seems to be a departure from that. I think you're turning into a robot, Jack. Anyway, I just like to mention that there is this very interesting thing about the transition from matriarchy to patriarchy, which is that in patriarchy, the harem is like a herd, which is herded by the alpha male, and the females within that herd are all undifferentiated from each other. And in patriarchy, when the veil is a big part of the pulling back of the veil is a big part of the marriage ceremony. That has to do with the face of the female mattering suddenly in patriarchy. And so there's just this very interesting thing, which is in our marriage ceremonies today, that is about the transition from matriarchy to patriarchy. It's just, it's fascinating how culture keeps all of these artifacts. So I mean, the whole point of me telling you that is that there may be some biological basis for what Freud was talking about, but the way that he made it basis of everything, that's completely wrong.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's seen in his reading of anatomy and stuff.
How so?
I don't remember. I actually forget. But I think to pull it up. But I've read somewhere. I'm really not well read in Freud by any definition. I think that shows. But I read somewhere that Freud, I mean, for when he was coming up with erogenous zones or phallic stages and stuff, he did a lot of analysis with anatomy to understand how they correlate. I think you see this also with Lacan's concept of the phallus, even though the phallus is the non-penis. Conceptually, there's this basis of anatomy that they're analyzing.
Right. So So you're making kind of the same point that there is something about human finitude that gets reflected into this Oedipal myth, but the way that is reflected into that myth, it becomes this disfigured image of desire, because the whole thing is that with the move from the animal basis to culture, a lot of these things become freed up so that you can have all kinds of structures in human desire that just don't come directly out of the instinctual basis. And I just think it's important to keep that in mind, that there is something to the Oedipus, but it's definitely this distorted image that is just happened to be what Freud seized upon and made universal when it wasn't necessarily anything universal about it.
Yeah, but I don't know. My reading is the whole point of distorted image is the problem that desire is going into a locale of this manner, and in this sense we are repressed, and that hence the problem is that Freud thought it was actual rather than virtual in a way.
Yeah, could be. Anyway, I'd just like to reiterate that in these last two chapters we read, there's a lot of detail in here, which we could really only talk about if we actually went out and read the basic books in this area. We're kind of flirting with it, but the whole point of this is that if you go and look at the actual data that we have on these things, that Lacanian theory just doesn't make any sense. I think that's their major point.
Well, I mean, I think it's the question of genealogy and Genesis, and where does all this stuff come from? And that's the great thing about this chapter is we're going to go through history and understand the question of genealogy. And the whole Deleuze's philosophy could honestly be summed up by just one word, right? Becoming or Genesis. The whole point is that the way he reads Kant's categories to consider the genesis of Kant's categories and all these other things. It's all about, and then you go into the pre-individual level for Deleuze, and that's coming from Simondon, but it's essentially about genesis at the end of the day. So, everything needs to be created. Like for Deleuze's reading of Spinoza, it's the expressionism, which is the immanent cause and God and all that. But they're going to look for... yeah, I'm not going to respond to that. But they're going to look for... essentially, they're going to look for... I don't think they actually deny anything. Like, I think what they're doing is... Well, I mean, yeah, I'm using the word deny here very specifically, right? They are denying a lot of stuff, but they're going to say we have to understand from the point of creation, how are these things produced?
It's kind of like the way you can think about it is that they're drawing a line in the sand of what they knew at that point, and they're going to take positions on it. And they're bringing Keynesianism in to critique both Marx and Freud, which is a big advance. And so, there's two things that have to be considered. Was, given the evidence that they had at their time, did their theory make sense? And then now that we know the things that we know today, does the theory make sense? And I think their major point is that given what they knew during their time, Lacan's did not make sense, and that it needs a lot more study to come up with cross-cultural ways of looking at these things. And also just within our own culture, it doesn't make sense. That was,
Yeah, I agree. I mean, but I'm not so staunch in the idea that they are disagreements. Like, I still hold pretty. I don't think Deleuze actually ever wrote a critique. I'm over exaggerating here, but I think it would be very. Wait, sorry, Lou, you're trying to say something?
I think it's bad form to assume that you can reduce these points to something that would be very easy to say. Like, if we are just talking about an empirical investigation into how valid is psychoanalysis, how valid is Lacan's psychoanalysis, that would be very easy and much easier than what they are actually writing here. And I know there's this suspicion that they just write obscure because for the sake of it. But I think they are trying to actually do something here that warrants the complexity of the work. And reducing this to this refutation on an empirical basis is a bit wonky, I think. And the other thing is, so I can't really, this is something that I've observed throughout the session. I think there's a tendency in specifically what you're doing, Kent, that to fall back onto a very classical structuralist reading of this that would fits better towards Levi-Strauss than to any of the post-structuralists. I'd be careful in that direction.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that's my basic tendency. Also, I agree with you that I'm not commenting in what I said before. I'm not commenting on what they're actually trying to get at so much as the critique of Lacan that's implicit in, like, the name of the Father. But I agree with you that they are doing something significant here that goes beyond that. And I think that where that comes up in the text is where they talk about, it was near where we stopped, these limits. When they talk about the different kinds of limits, you got the absolute limit, the relative limit, the real limit, the imaginary limit, the displaced limit. that, I think, they're doing something significant that goes beyond just the critique of Kant.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is to understand. I mean, I think what makes them so complex is I think they're actually affirming everything. And they're affirming Oedipus complex, but then they're going to ask the question of how it is created. And then when we ask the question, these pre-individual questions of how it was created, rather than structural, they're operational questions of how these things are created. We understand that the primary goal actually is not to critique. The primary goal, in my opinion, for everything Deleuze and even Guattari wrote was always to create something new, the creation of concepts. And, as Todd May gives this example of the French Impressionist painters who just by creating stuff rather than going against the old guard of the classicists, they achieve something new and naturally kill off the classicists, right? It's a sense that the goal is to create concepts at the end of the day that are that have a purpose, and it's not a teleological function, but it's the fact that these things are doing it. And I agree with Lou. I agree with that 100% because it is the sense that it needs to be understood in the sense that it is very complex and nuanced, which is much harder to understand from the sense that they're affirming everything. But they're affirming that there is an Oedipus complex, and they're not just saying, oh, it's just a bunch of. I think I brought that point up last time also when I was talking about the contemporary understanding of psychoanalysis and stuff. But it asks a much deeper question, in my opinion, of how are these things produced.
You could read this to say, it says schizophrenia is the absolute limit and capitalism is the relative limit. So those are two kinds of limits. And then they said, they talk about when you start talking about it in terms of money, flows of production, that's the real limit. And then they have this imaginary limit. And then the fifth one, Oedipus is the displaced limit. Yes, Oedipus is universal. So, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I understand that, but I think it's very interesting. And, but I'd say that's the positive thing that they're doing, distinguishing these different kinds of limits.
Yeah. Okay, I think with that, we reached the 2-hour mark, so I'm going to have to tell Crickbot to leave just so Brooks doesn't have to have any editing problems. But
sure.
Yeah, it's a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much.